Everyone's ready. So, everybody else ready? Okay. 1 second. So the recognition of the witnesses is going to go from left to right. Mr. Dodge will go first in this classroom. Mr. Smith. Okay, very good. Good afternoon, and welcome to this joint subcommittee hearing of the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Asia and the Pacific and the Armed Services Subcommittee on Sea Power and Projection Forces. I want to thank Chairman Forbes for joining this afternoon with us and collaborating with the Asia Pacific Subcommittee on the critically important topic of today's hearing, which is the issue of maritime security in the South and East China Seas. I also want to thank Mr. Ami Bera for serving as the acting ranking member for Asia and Pacific Subcommittee, and Ranking Member McIntyre for also joining us this afternoon. We look forward to an excellent hearing. Today's hearing could not come at a more critical time, as we have seen over the last few months a growing level of tension in the Asia-Pacific region as a result of unilateral actions taken by China to exert its control over disputed maritime territories. We are witnessing a dangerously aggressive China trying to assert greater control over these territories to change the regional status quo in a way that violates core principles of international law. The implications of these actions for the United States are substantial, as we have strategic and economic interests that are increasingly threatened by the growing tension and confrontational incidents in these waters. An American presence in Asia is built on maintaining peace and stability that is upheld through respect for international law, freedom of navigation, and unhindered lawful commerce in the maritime regions. This is pursued through our alliances with Japan, South Korea, Australia, Thailand, and the Philippines, in addition to our steadfast relationships with Taiwan and Singapore, and evolving relationships with Vietnam and Indonesia. In recognition of the region's growing importance, the U.S. policy rebalance toward Asia largely served as an acknowledgment of our long-term goal of ensuring we remain firmly engaged in this region. This so-called pivot came at a crucial time, no doubt long overdue, because our regional friends and allies needed assurance of sustained U.S. commitment. While I may take issue with the lack of depth of the administration's rebalance strategy, one thing is certain. We do have a grounded diplomatic, economic, and military commitment to the region. There is no other issue right now in the Asia-Pacific region more worrisome than the rising tensions we are seeing as a result of China's efforts to coercively change and destabilize the regional status quo. While I am disappointed by China's behavior, I am also not terribly surprised that it is failing to behave as a responsible global actor. Among the most prevalent reasons why China is motivated to fight for its claims, which include oil and gas reserves, fishing rights, control of shipping lanes, and the establishment of security buffer zones, its view that its maritime territorial claims have deep historical roots is the most problematic. There are a number of instances in history where nationalism was used to further international political goals with damaging consequences. Take, for instance, the incident when, back in 1983, Soviet jet fighters intercepted a Korean Airlines passenger flight allegedly flying in Russian airspace, and with heat-seeking missiles shot down into the China Sea, killing all 268 passengers and crew members, including a U.S. congressman. President Reagan called the incident a massacre, and tensions between the U.S. and Soviet Union dramatically increased. Similar motivations were behind the April 2001 Hainan Island incident, when a People's Liberation Army Navy jet recklessly or intentionally collided with a U.S. EP-3 aircraft flying within China's exclusive economic zone. And now China's unilateral decision to establish an air defense identification zone in the East China Sea is its latest move to act upon historically contentious maritime territorial disputes with Japan. This move was further intensified this month when China established a new Hainan administrative zone and ordered all foreign fishing vessels to obtain approval before fishing in or surveying two-thirds of the South China Sea. Both these actions have only further inflamed what former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd called an Asian tinderbox on water. While China's actions over the past few years in piecemeal may seem small, as a whole they depict a fundamental change in China's foreign policy and strategy. It is no longer following a policy of peaceful resolution or taking actions that align with international law, if it ever did in the first place. China is attempting to take the disputed territories by gradual force under the guise and misguided hope that Japan, Southeast Asian nations, and the U.S. will just grudgingly accept it. This provocative behavior, as the Obama administration has called it, unnecessarily raises tensions, threatening the security and stability of the region, targeting key U.S. allies, and challenging the U.S. presence as a Pacific power. As we have seen, players in the region are responding. Japan is taking steps to reshape its own national security apparatus to better respond to the rise of Chinese threats, a policy I support. The Philippines has also been vocal about its disagreements with China's territorial claims, requesting arbitration against China under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea last year. Reports this weekend indicate the Philippines is building its military presence in the Zhangyi Island, and China is now insisting that it plans to attack Philippine forces on the island to recover territory that Philippines allegedly stole. This all follows the administration's decision to send B-52 bombers out of Guam to fly through the new defense zone in the East China Sea, and its plans to give nearly $32 million to Vietnam to strengthen maritime security, with a promise to provide the Philippines with $40 million to do the same. While these actions should send a strong message to China to be wary of taking further provocative actions, we cannot be sure. As we saw when the USS Cowpens narrowly avoided collision with a Chinese warship in December, heightened tensions between the U.S. and China, and also our allies, are only increasing the risk of miscalculation in the region. I believe steps taken by the U.S. and Japan to revise our alliance's bilateral defense guidelines to better deal with new contingencies is a good step, as is the consideration to locate U.S. troops in the Philippines on a rotational basis, as we've done in Australia. At the same time, I believe the administration needs to do a better job at understanding and predicting China's strategic goals and clearly conveying that the U.S. is committed and prepared to work with and support our regional allies. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses this afternoon regarding their views on how the U.S. can better manage obligations to our friends and allies to limit conflict with China in the coming months. I want to again thank Chairman Forbes for his subcommittee for collaborating on today's hearing, and I'd now like to recommend Chairman Forbes for the purpose of making an opening statement.
Thank you, and I'd like to thank Chairman Chabot for offering to work with our subcommittee on this important topic. There are many areas of interest that overlap between our two subcommittees and create natural areas for cooperation, and I hope this joint hearing will be the first of many to come in the future. With the continued escalation of tensions in the East and South China Seas, or what China calls its near seas, I think it's essential for Congress to closely monitor this issue and affirmatively state our reservations with its present course. My greatest fear is that China's coercive methods of dealing with territorial disputes could manifest into increased tensions that could ultimately lead to miscalculation. This heightened use of coercive actions by Chinese naval vessels now spans the East and South China Seas, from Japan's Senkaku Islands, the Scarborough Shoals, the Spratly Islands, and indeed the entire South China Sea. It's difficult for me to understand why China is pursuing the more aggressive actions it has over the past years, given how much it has benefited from the rules-based order the U.S. and its allies have sustained in the Asia-Pacific region for the last 65 years. This order has made the region more prosperous, more transparent, and above all, more peaceful. However, it is clear that as China has expanded its military forces and capabilities, their government has chosen a more strident path in the pursuit of its regional goals and ambitions, including the territorial claims we're here to discuss today. I believe we must be 100% intolerant of China's territorial claims and its continued resort to forms of military coercion to alter the status quo in the region. This requires not just maintaining a robust military and strong diplomatic posture, but also working closely with our friends and allies to understand their concerns and find ways to strengthen our common cause to preserve free access to the global commons. As Congress shifts its attention more closely to the Asia-Pacific region, I'm pleased to see bipartisan support for our nation continuing to play a strong leadership role in the region. Before I conclude, I also want to recognize Mr. Mike McIntyre for his dedicated support to the men and women in uniform, the 7th District of North Carolina, and to the greater United States. Mike, you've been a good friend and a consummate statesman, and our nation will be at a loss when you depart the House of Representatives at the conclusion of this session. I'll clearly miss your friendship and your expertise. And today I also want to thank our experts for being here. We look forward to your testimony, and we greatly appreciate you taking time to be here to share your knowledge and expertise with our two committees. Again, I want to thank Chairman Chabot for holding this joint hearing, and I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman, and I'd now like to turn to the ranking member from North Carolina, Mr. McIntyre, for the purpose of making an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to our witnesses today and to those who are here, and thank you to my subcommittee chairman and my good friend Randy Forbes for your very kind words and unexpected at this time. Thank you. That really means a lot personally and professionally, and thank you for your leadership. The Chinese government's recent behavior regarding maritime and airspace boundaries is of growing concern to the U.S. and to our allies in the region. And it is important for Congress to keep a close watch on this situation. I'm especially pleased we're doing this hearing jointly today with the Foreign Affairs Committee, because we know in many situations there's not always a military solution. We have to always be ready militarily, but we realize that it's critical that we have diplomatic and political aspects to be considered, and obviously they are always the first recourse and the first choice when trying to resolve concerns. We want to make sure that we have that perspective. We have a full range of tools at our disposal to consider when we look at various crises that may arise in this region. Not every problem we know has a military solution. It's likely to mean that we should be in a position to look at how best we can resolve maritime disputes with China, and that we can have a more robust diplomacy engaged in this region rather than seeking a military standoff. We know that Japan has a strong military. However, some of our other allies in the region do not, and that they are being intimidated, especially in the South China Sea. So without the naval and maritime air capabilities to patrol and protect this territory, many nations in the region are at a major disadvantage when they do feel threatened militarily. So over time, we have to address these imbalances between China and the countries in that region that could have a significant impact on China's actions, but also have a significant impact on these countries and their security and safety. The U.S. does have a major role to play in working with China with regard to international standards of conduct, and we should support our regional allies in every way we can to make sure that our allies are considered equal partners with us. And we've had other briefings where the military has laid out its ambitions to engage with and sometimes train our regional allies. Those military efforts are absolutely important, but we realize that those military efforts cannot stand as the sole response. We must have a concerted diplomatic effort, and right now we do not quite seem to have reached that goal of having that concerted diplomatic effort. We must be able to make sure that we are not always reacting, but also being proactive in making sure that we have the best possible diplomatic solutions as well as the best possible military preparation to make sure that we're in a situation where we can resolve differences and be able to avoid conflict. We are very thankful for those who serve in our military and are always ready and on standby, and we want them to always be in a position to be prepared. We also now must make sure that we're always prepared to handle matters diplomatically and do what we can to help resolve conflict. We look forward to hearing from today's panel of experts, and thank you for your time with us, and thank you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Rankin.
I thank the gentleman for his opening statement. The ranking member of the Asia and Pacific Subcommittee is unable to be here, Mr. Felipe Vega. So the acting ranking member is Ami Berra from California, and would like to recognize Ami for making an opening statement.
Great. Thank you, Chairman Chabot. Thank you, Chairman Forbes, for what is incredibly important, crucial, and timely hearing on maritime sovereignty in the South and East China Seas. I believe it's important for us as a Congress to really begin exploring what actions we should take to maintain these key maritime and airspace routes and keep them open. I also am deeply concerned about the actions China took, particularly the rapidity of the announcement on unilaterally establishing a new East China Sea Air Defense Identification Zone, an ADIZ. China's dramatic ADIZ expansion really extends over the East China Sea territories that historically have been under Japan's administrative control and certainly overlaps with the ADIZs of Japan and the Republic of Korea, two important allies of the United States. China is also now requiring that foreign aircraft file flight plans if they intend to fly in Chinese airspace, and has threatened that their armed forces would respond in cases of noncompliance. Furthermore, China continues to exhibit a disturbing trend in their foreign policy. We've seen this before. If we look at the example of the South China Sea, as they extended, and if you look at the 9-dash line area, it creates conflict, it creates tension and uncertainty. And, if we don't respond immediately, over time, it becomes much more complex and much more difficult for us to address. The 9-dash line affects island groups and reefs that are also claimed by Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Taiwan, Vietnam, all important trading partners of the United States, and all at a crucial time when we are demonstrating this pivot to Asia. And the United States has a role in mediating and lowering the volume here a bit. China is also requiring that all foreign fishing vessels obtain permission from China to navigate these contested waters. Unacceptable. Chinese authorities are showing vigor in pushing maritime power as a fundamental national goal and one that they are willing to challenge anyone on. We've got to send, as a body, in a bipartisan manner, a strong message to China that these threatening and provocative moves to assert their maritime territorial claims are unacceptable. These steps clearly undermine the peace and stability of the Asia-Pacific. If China is left unchallenged, China's claims over the region will solidify, thus altering the status quo. The time for provocative and strategic engagement with our allies is now, before China's next move, like more ADIZ expansions for the South China Sea or the Yellow Sea. We've got to do this immediately. China and the other nations in the region must address any outstanding territorial and jurisdictional issues by engaging in diplomatic dialogue and not through coercion, threats, or force. International laws and norms must be upheld in order to de-escalate tensions and mitigate any risk of an accidental military clash. And that is dangerous. Given the importance of trade and transport in this region, the U.S. must navigate and enforce the rights to freely navigate in these contested areas. Again, Mr. Chairman, thank you for calling this important hearing. I look forward to hearing the testimony as the witnesses and working together as a body. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for his statement, and the Chair would be pleased to extend an opportunity for members to make a 1-minute opening statement if they would like to do so. The gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrabacher, is recognized.
Thank you very much. The alarm bells may finally be ringing, what some of us have been warning about for years, that the fact that we have been treating China, the world's worst human rights abuser, as if it was a democratic ally. We have been giving trade and economic benefits to the Chinese government, which is, I say, the world's worst human rights abuser, a vicious dictatorship. We've been giving better rights than we do to some of our own friends and some of our democratic allies. They've had most favored nation status now for almost 20 years. Some of our other allies haven't had that. And now they've built up their economic might, and surprise, surprise, they're using their new capabilities to build a very powerful military machine that threatens the peace and stability not only of that region but of the world. Well, I would call on this administration and my colleagues and all of us who want peace and believe in democracy. It is time for us to back up 100% our allies who are frontline confronting this new threat, whether it's Australia, Japan, Taiwan, Korea, or the Philippines. We need to get behind them in a big way and send that message to Beijing. There is no faltering on our part on supporting these countries, these democratic countries, against this dictatorship's claims and its military buildup in the region. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. Does the gentleman from Connecticut wish to make? Okay, the gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, is recognized for the purpose of making a 1-minute statement.
Our national policy establishment has embraced the new phrase, pivot toward Asia, which sounds like more trade delegations to Tokyo and more Chinese language courses in our university, but actually means that the fight against Islamic extremism is either over or it's inconvenient, and we're directing our national security efforts toward confronting China as the new enemy. Already, the Pentagon is shifting its design of its research and ultimately forces toward taking on the Chinese Navy. We are told that we need to pivot to Asia to protect tiny specks that may be of some economic value to countries that spend far less of their GDP than we do, protecting their own little island specks. The fact is that a confrontation with China may give our national security establishment the kind of glorious enemy that they would like to have, rather than the frustrations of dealing with asymmetric conflict against an enemy that doesn't wear uniforms. But the fact is, these are tiny specks. Those nations that claim them are willing to fight to get, as long as we spend trillions of dollars to protect what might be billions of dollars of assets. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman's time's expired. Gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Salmon, is recognized for a minute.
Thank you. I'd like to thank my chairman, Steve Shabbat, and Chairman Forbes for holding this joint hearing on this critical national security and foreign policy issue. Over the last several years, we've seen increased aggressions in the disputed waters of the South China Sea and, more recently, the East China Sea. As China has sought to expand their control of the region, U.S. allies are struggling to ensure their sovereignty is maintained and navigational rights to the South and East China Seas protected. Military and commercial access to the navigable waters of the South and East China Seas are critical to the security and economic viability of every country in the region. Strong U.S. allies, including Japan, Taiwan, and Philippines, Vietnam, and South Korea, have come under increasing pressure from China to cede or temper these inalienable sovereign rights to the Chinese will. There must be a peaceful path forward to protect the U.S. regional allies that ensures U.S. national security interests and avoids unnecessarily conflict and aggressions. President Ma of Taiwan has proposed the East China Sea Peace Initiative as a means to resolving disputes peacefully by exercising restraint, refraining from taking antagonistic actions, following international law, and continuing dialogue. I hope the Chinese and the other regional powers will embrace this as a solution going forward. China has indicated a desire to settle disputes peacefully, but has been unwilling to open dialogue and negotiations in a multilateral way. This is disappointing. We've got to continue to align with our allies in assuring their sovereign rights to open commercial and military access to the waters of the South and East China Seas. Hopefully, the Chinese will work with their neighbors and implement a peaceful, multilateral dispute resolution system that will protect all countries' sovereign rights going forward. Thank you. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Would the gentleman from Georgia be interested? The gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Yes, I will take the opportunity to say that we face some very serious issues throughout the world. Sequestration and budget numbers in that area don't help us out a whole lot when it comes to confronting these challenges, both in the Middle East and the Asia Pacific. But I will say I'm happy to share this room today with members of the Foreign Affairs Committee, because if ever there has been a time for diplomacy, it is now. And so with that, I will yield back.
I thank the gentleman for yielding back. Would other members like to make opening statements on either side? If you could indicate you do, I'd be happy to recognize others. Okay. If not, we'll go ahead and proceed to the introduction of the witness panel. We have a very distinguished panel of witnesses here this afternoon. We'll begin with Mr. Peter Dutton, who's Professor of Strategic Studies and the Director of the China Maritime Studies Institute at the U.S. Naval War College. Professor Dutton's current research focuses on American and Chinese views of sovereignty and international law of the sea, and the strategic implications to the United States and the United States Navy of Chinese international law and policy choices. Professor Dutton is widely published and has previously testified for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He also researches and lectures on topics related to international law of the sea, issues in the East and South China Seas, East and Southeast Asia, and the Arctic, in addition to the Proliferation Security Initiative and Maritime Strategy. He is a retired Navy judge advocate and holds a Juris Doctor from the College of William & Mary, my alma mater, a master's with distinction from the Naval War College, and a Bachelor of Science cum laude from Boston University. We welcome you, Mr. Dutton. I'd like to introduce also the other panel members. We also have Bonnie S. Glazer, who is a Senior Advisor for Asia and the Freeman Chair in China Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where she works on issues related to Chinese foreign and security policy. She is concurrently a Senior Associate with CSIS Pacific Forum and a consultant for the U.S. government on East Asia. Ms. Glazer previously served as Senior Associate in the CSIS International Security Program. Prior to joining CSIS, she served as a consultant for various U.S. government offices, including the Departments of Defense and State. Ms. Glazer has written extensively on Chinese threat perceptions and U.S.-China strategy. She received her B.A. in Political Science from Boston University and her M.A. with concentrations in International Economics and Chinese Studies from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and we welcome you here this afternoon, Ms. Glazer. And our final witness will be Jeff M. Smith, who is the Kramer Strategy Fellow at the American Foreign Policy Council, AFPC, and the author of a forthcoming book on China-India relations in the 21st century. He also serves as the managing editor of the World Almanac of Islamism and the editor of AFPC's South Asia Security Monitor. He has provided briefings and consultations for the Pentagon, State Department, and intelligence community. Mr. Smith's writings have appeared in the Wall Street Journal of Asia, U.S. News and World Report, among others. Additionally, he has been a commentator for many world news organizations such as BBC and others. Smith has a MPIA from University of Pittsburgh's Graduate School of Public and International Affairs and studied abroad at Oxford University in 2005. He has lectured on the graduate and undergraduate level. And we welcome all three of you here this afternoon. I apologize for my voice, which is not up to the standards it ought to be, but not much I can do about it. I'm sure that the panel is familiar with the 5-minute rule. You'll each have 5 minutes to testify. We have a lighting system. The yellow light will come on when you have 1 minute to wrap up. We'd appreciate it if you wrap up as closely to when the red light comes on as possible. And Professor Dutton, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, ranking members, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you very much for the opportunity to testify before you today. The first question I was asked to address has to do with what it is that China's extension of power over the near seas gains for China. And the extension of China's strategic power over its near seas through expanding military capabilities, growing law enforcement capacity, sweeping legal frameworks augmented by orchestrated civilian activities, and political and economic arm twisting has deep strategic roots. And the roots are grounded in China's view that prior to 1840, and this goes back in history, but prior to 1840, when China dominated the East Asian system, it was a continental system. All of the strategic events occurred on the continent, and China could dominate the maritime periphery, and the maritime periphery could not dominate China. After 1840, that reversed. It is the maritime periphery where the strategic actions in Asia have been evolving, and it is in the American interest for it to remain that way. So first and foremost, it is the failure of previous Chinese leaders to close the maritime gap in China's arc of security and the invasions from the sea that resulted that motivates China's current leaders to extend strategic power of the near seas, and which provides them internal domestic legitimacy. I think that's important to note. Second, as China advances, the aim of China's regional maritime strategy as it advances is to expand its interior control over the near seas to cover the maritime domain under an umbrella of continental control for the purpose of enhancing that perceived security that China gains from this. So the two attributes that China gets are security and leadership legitimacy from extending its control over the region. Second, what does this have to do with the Senkakus? Chinese activities around the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands have, since December 2008, been designed to create a circumstance that puts Japanese control over the islands in doubt. The manner in which Chinese activities are conducted is carefully calibrated to achieve the objective without provoking outright conflict with the United States. China's strategy can best be described, in my view, as non-militarized coercion. Non-militarized coercion involves the direct and indirect application of a broad range of national capabilities to favorably alter the situation at sea in China's favor. That does not mean that the military has no role to play. The military's role, however, is indirect as part of the escalation control mechanism that China uses not to provoke conflict with the United States as it pursues its objectives. The integrated process of power and law accurately describes the events around the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands and also at the Scarborough Shoal in the South China Sea, over which China wrestled full control from the Philippines over a year ago. There are many other examples in various stages of development around China's periphery, including China's claim to the East China Sea continental shelf and China's advancing claims to administer the waters within the 9-dashed or U-shaped line in the South China Sea. The third question is, what does the Air Defense Identification Zone have to do with this? Well, China's strategy to control water and airspace is similar to its power and law approach to controlling the islands in the East and South China Sea. The purpose of China's force structure component is obviously to develop the power to dominate events in the near seas according to China's will. The purpose of the legal component of China's strategy is to articulate a legitimizing narrative for the development and employment of this power. So China's aid is part of a coordinated legal campaign to extend maximal security jurisdiction over the East China Sea and the international airspace above it beyond the authorities currently allowed by international law in support of its objectives related to security, resource control, and regional order. And so what are the policy implications for the United States? Well, there are many, but I'd like to point out just a few. The first is the Chinese have been talking about this great power, new type great power relationship with the United States. I think we need to come back with expectations that China will become a responsible leading power. Leading in the sense that leadership over the existing global system of institutionalized economic and security mechanisms designed to foster regional and global stability and economic progress. Responsible as a supporter and defender of that system in all its attributes, the institutions, the laws, the rules, the principles and norms, and refraining from self-interested actions that conflict with them. And power in recognition that China is one of only a few states with global economic, political, and security interests and some capacity to exercise global leadership. I have a number of recommendations we can talk about during testimony if you'd like. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman for your testimony, and we'll turn to Ms. Glazer. You're recognized for 5 minutes. If you could turn the mic on there, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Members, distinguished members of the subcommittees for this opportunity to offer my thoughts on China's maritime disputes. As you have all said, disputes in the waters and airspace off China's eastern coastline have fueled increased tensions in recent years, both between China and its neighbors and between China and the United States. How Beijing manages these disputes is widely seen as a litmus test of China's broader strategic intentions, and how the United States responds to China's growing propensity to use coercion, bullying, and salami-slicing tactics to secure its territorial and maritime interests is increasingly viewed as a key measure of success of the U.S. rebalance to Asia. The risk of a clash with the attendant potential for escalation is highest today, I think, between China and Japan in the East China Sea. And the United States could become entangled in such a Sino-Japanese conflict as a result of its obligations under the U.S.-Japan Mutual Security Treaty. China's recent declaration of an ADIZ that overlaps substantially with Japan's ADIZ and covers the disputed islands significantly increases that risk of accident and miscalculation. China's salami-slicing tactics have been evident in both the East China Sea and the South China Sea. Through a steady progression of small steps, none of which by itself is a casus belli, China seeks to gradually change the status quo in its favor, and it is scoring some victories without adequate consequences. China's efforts to restrict free use of the maritime commons is also worrying. We saw the recent example on December 5th in which the PLA Navy vessel engaged in dangerous maneuvers to stop the USS Cowpens from observing drills conducted by China's aircraft carrier. And as U.S. and Chinese vessels operate in increasingly close proximity, I think such incidents are likely to increase. Regional concerns about territorial and maritime disputes in the Asia-Pacific are very much on the rise. East Asian governments increasingly view closer ties with the United States as a useful hedge against potential domineering behavior by China. Virtually every country in Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia has been publicly or privately supportive of the U.S. rebalance to Asia. They hope the U.S. will sustain its role as balancer and as a counterweight to Chinese power. But I must emphasize that doubts persist about the credibility and the constancy of U.S. power. The U.S. has multiple interests at stake in these maritime disputes. We all know the U.S. supports, we have at stake the maintenance of freedom of navigation, the encouragement of a rules-based international system, the maintenance of U.S. credibility and influence in the region, certainly the peaceful resolution of disputes. We also have an interest in the development of a cooperative relationship with a rising China. And in the coming decade, the U.S. role, I think, will be pivotal in shaping the strategic landscape in the Asia-Pacific region. We must continue to be engaged economically, diplomatically, and militarily to influence the future balance of power in the region and ensure that it remains favorable to the interests of the United States, its allies, and its partners. Congress can play a vital role in this process, and my recommendations for Congress going forward are as follows. First, Congress should require the executive branch to produce a strategy paper on the rebalance to Asia. The paper should establish explicit objectives and benchmarks for evaluating progress, and this should include incentives to China to abide by international law and practices, as well as consequences for violating them. Second, Congress should encourage other governments and legislatures in the Asia-Pacific to back the Philippines' right to use available international arbitration mechanisms to address its territorial dispute with China. If this tribunal rules in Manila's favor and China does not comply, this will have profoundly negative impact on peace and stability in the region. This is a way to tether China to a rules-based order. It is an opportunity. Third, the United States Senate, I believe, should ratify UNCLOS to increase the effectiveness of U.S. efforts to pursue a rules-based approach to managing and resolving disputes over maritime jurisdiction. And fourth, Congress should enact trade promotion authority legislation so that the administration can persuade the other countries negotiating the TPP that the U.S. will be able not just to sign, but also ratify a high-standard TPP agreement. Maintaining American economic leadership in the Asia-Pacific is imperative to enhancing the U.S. ability to achieve its other interests, including the promotion of a rules-based system and the peaceful settlement of maritime disputes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Mr. Smith, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
I'd like to thank the Chairman and the Ranking Members for the opportunity.
If you could turn the mic, thank you.
I'd like to thank the Chairman and the Ranking Members for the opportunity to appear before you today. In recent months, the world's attention has been focused on China's provocative behavior toward the Senkaku and Diaoyu Island dispute, and for good reason. That dispute demands our utmost attention and poses a tangible risk for interstate conflict in the years to come. However, the issue of maritime sovereignty in the East and South China Seas encompasses more than simply China's territorial disputes with its neighbors. I want to focus my remarks on a disagreement between the U.S. and China over the type of sovereignty China is claiming in its 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone, or EEZ, and specifically the right of the U.S. military to conduct surveillance operations there. Our dispute derives from differing interpretations of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS, a treaty the U.S. has not signed but whose maritime boundary distinctions we observe in practice. Under Beijing's interpretation, China enjoys expansive sovereign rights in its EEZ, including the right to deny U.S. military access to conduct surveillance operations. China is not alone in this interpretation. At least 16 other countries share Beijing's position. but China is the only country that has operationally challenged U.S. forces, leading to more than half dozen dangerous confrontations at sea over the past decade, which are documented in the appendix to my testimony. The U.S. and most countries of the world reject this interpretation of UNCLOS, arguing that China cannot treat the EEZ as if it were a sovereign territorial sea. My testimony shows how U.S. scholars have thoroughly debunked Beijing's reading of the treaty, and that UNCLOS does not require home state consent to conduct surveillance operations in an EEZ. Yet the confrontations continue, and if the U.S. and China don't come to a modus vivendi on a code of maritime conduct in the Western Pacific, the possibility for escalation and confrontation is very real. Further aggravating the situation is the poor military-to-military relationship between our two countries. Though we have taken some small steps forward in engaging the PLA in recent years, MIL-MIL remains the most underdeveloped and concerning aspect of bilateral relations. While the political and professional Chinese elite are experiencing an unprecedented level of exposure to the outside world, this encouraging trend has not yet reached the People's Liberation Army, which tightly restricts contacts with the U.S., particularly for junior officers. By design, the PLA ranks remain conspiracy-minded, hawkish, and insulated from the Western world, and even to some liberal influences within China. This is worrying because many Chinese nationalists inside and outside the PLA see the U.S. as engaged in a containment strategy designed to prevent China's rise and undermine its security. Firebrand nationalists are taking to the airwaves and web pages to denounce a U.S. foreign policy they believe is aggravating China's territorial disputes with Japan, the Philippines, and Vietnam. And China's leaders are increasingly pandering to these nationalists, escalating their own hawkish rhetoric, and in the process restricting their freedom to maneuver in the future. The trend is worrying enough that last year the vice president of the PLA's Academy of Military Science warned publicly that PLA commentators were inciting public sentiment and causing interference with our high-level policy decision-making and deployments. Testing boundaries and establishing new status quos favorable to China has been a defining feature of its regional policy in recent years. When the U.S. and other countries have faltered in the face of this policy, as was the case with the Philippines and the Scarborough Shoal, China has advanced its goals and established a new status quo. However, where the U.S. has held firm in its position and demonstrated resolve, Beijing has backed down. The same resolve must be committed to surveillance activities in China's EEZ. America's position on this issue is not only within the U.S. national interest, it is fully supported by domestic and international law. Were we to accept China's interpretation of UNCLOS, U.S. military vessels could be barred from operating in large swaths of the world's oceans, an outcome that is clearly unacceptable to Washington and one never envisioned by the drafters of UNCLOS. The U.S. has in the past attempted to create a code of conduct with China on these matters. However, talks have been stalled on Chinese demands that the U.S. end arms sales to Taiwan, put an end to surveillance activities, and repeal provisions of the 2000 National Defense Authorization Act. The U.S. should do everything at its disposal to ensure future incidents do not escalate, but it must reaffirm that U.S. policy will not be subject to fear, intimidation, coercion, or reckless behavior from Chinese naval forces. Furthermore, Washington must do a better job drawing clear red lines around unacceptable behavior in the maritime arena and enforce those red lines when they are crossed. To that end, the U.S. should continue an active schedule of surveillance activities, patrolling, and freedom of navigation operations. America carries a special burden on this issue. While Beijing views its neighbors as subservient regional powers, the Chinese leadership acknowledges and respects American power, even as they increasingly resent that power. As perhaps the only country capable of drawing and enforcing red lines, America's allies in the region are depending on the U.S. to be a firewall against Chinese aggression in the Western Pacific. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony. I now recognize each of the members for 5 minutes to ask questions, and I'll recognize myself at this time. Ms. Glazer, let me start with you first if I can. In your testimony, you recommended that Congress urge the executive branch to impose consequences on China when they violate international laws and norms. How do you propose the administration penalize China or punish China or whatever the proper verb would be for violating international laws, such as its decision to unilaterally impose an air defense identification zone, for example?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for your very important question. I think that the administration took one very important step, and that was flying our B-52s through that zone, not recognizing the zone. I think we should be doing more. The United States and Japan, for example, could conduct joint flights through that zone. In other words, the message is that China's behavior threatens the security of its neighbors, and therefore there is a stepped-up military response. So there should be, I think, greater cooperation. I would also like to see the United States continue to encourage greater military cooperation among Japan and South Korea and the United States, which is ongoing and I think has been somewhat complicated by some of the political decisions recently made in Japan by Prime Minister Abe in his visit to the Yasukuni Shrine. But I think that ultimately these are very, very important. In other cases, I think that the United States can adopt targeted sanctions or responses to Chinese behavior. For example, in the cyber area, it has been widely discussed how the United States might adopt some very targeted sanctions that are aimed at responding to China's use of cyber to steal intellectual property, commercial proprietary information. So those are some of the examples that I would give. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Dutton, let me turn to you next, if I can. You mentioned a couple of things that I wanted to touch on. In your testimony, you said that unless current trends in the region change, there is no reason to believe that China's campaign will stop short of achieving its aims, which are gaining the upper hand on regional security, redeveloping the regional order, and gaining control of maritime resources. You also said that the U.S. should seek to develop a new type great power relationship with China. Excuse me. What does such a relationship look like? And in terms of this trend China is creating, I believe it's in our interest to slow that trend down and, in fact, to stop it. How do you also suggest that we accomplish that?
Yes, thank you very much for the question. First, I'd like to say that U.S. and regional strategies have largely been reactive. In other words, China has had and maintained the initiative. I think we need to restore the initiative in this process by thinking about, rather than what I'll call negative objectives, in other words, prevent bad things from happening, let's have a positive objective, which is to create a region that is fully integrated into the global system and stable at the same time. So part of what I was articulating, since I submitted the testimony, I thought more about your question, and actually in my oral comments made the point that we need to expect China to be a responsible leading power, not just a, frankly, self-interested regional leading power. Right? We need to expect them to do more for the system and to support the system because of the benefits that they receive from it. What that means is, in terms of the consequences that my colleague, Ms. Glaser, is talking about, we need to think about consequences that broaden the horizon of options. In other words, if we just respond in kind, if China provokes, we respond with a similar kind of action, then we're still being reactive. So we need to think more broadly about the type of responses. So if China does something in the security field, well, maybe we need an economic or political reaction to it, not just a security reaction, in ways that imposes a cost on China that China would prefer not to have to pay. For instance, China was invited to join the Arctic Council recently. That's a benefit that China has received. There are other similar kinds of things that China would like to receive. Well, we need to impose costs when China fails to act in ways that benefit and support the system. We're inviting them to share responsible leadership into the system. Now we need to expect them to maintain proper leadership over the system's rules, norms, principles, and laws.
Thank you very much. My time has expired. The gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Courtney, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for organizing this hearing and the witnesses for their outstanding testimony. Mr. Dutton, in your sort of policy recommendations starting on page 9, again, deterrence was certainly one of the recommendations you set forth. And in particular, you said, in terms of naval power, I am especially concerned that the U.S. continue to invest in maintaining its advantage in undersea warfare. I mean, given the fact that some of these bodies of water are described as relatively shallow. Maybe you could just sort of explain your thoughts on that.
Well, certainly. First, I would certainly, sir. Thank you for the question. First of all, the ability to impose maritime actions in East Asia requires our ability to access the water space. And although, yes, in some parts of the East China Sea in particular, the water space is relatively shallow, and submarine operations in that particular location may or may not be appropriate. I'm not a submariner, I don't know. But the truth of the matter is the submarine component of American naval power is one in which we enjoy an advantage, and that advantage is one that we need to maintain in order to maintain our access for all forces within the region. That's the point I'm trying to make.
Okay, thank you. And your second recommendation, again, talked about sort of coordinating with our allies in the region in terms of making sure that not everybody's kind of duplicating, I guess, resources. The New York Times the other day had an editorial, "The Submarine Race in Asia," which talked about how the Vietnamese Navy and the Malaysian Navy, and I mean everybody's Navy is sort of rushing to buy or build submarines. Your recommendation seems to be that some of these allies should be more focused on sort of Whitehall, Coast Guard-like capability, and sort of, I guess I'm sort of, well, maybe you can tell me, are you sort of suggesting that the sort of military side should be sort of the U.S. Navy's realm? Am I reading that right?
Well, we certainly welcome support. I think the United States Navy has been very open and clear about that. I don't mean to speak for the Navy. What I mean to say is that the Navy has been very open in terms of support for naval activities in the region. But what we don't want to see is a negative spiral, negative security spiral. What we want to see is a more positive direction for maritime power in the region. And one of the things, countries will make their own decisions about what force structures they need to have. But one of the things that it is important that all countries in the region be able to do is to enforce their own maritime interests in terms of their exclusive economic zone and the fisheries issues that they have, rather than simply allowing China to continue to build its law enforcement capacity without any regional response. So I'm not suggesting that the regional states should not make their own decisions about their force structure, but I do hate to see a negative regional spiral in which countries are starting to get into arms races that could be very destabilizing.
Great, thank you. Ms. Glazer, sort of there's been a little bit of what came first, the chicken or the egg? Is it the Asia-Pacific pivot that stimulated the claim of territorial space, or is the pivot in reaction to the claims of territorial space? And I just wonder if you could sort of give your thoughts in terms of, the Asia pivot, in terms of whether it was justified or whether it's provoking a negative reaction.
Well, thank you very much for that question. I think that's actually a narrative that is quite common in China. And I think when the Obama administration came to power, they had the idea, this is particularly in 2009, that China was going to be a partner on a range of issues that were very important for the United States. We heard officials talk about how no global problem could be solved without Chinese cooperation. So global warming, proliferation, the global financial crisis, these were all things that the United States was going to work with China on. And this was really born at the same time that the pivot really came into being, even though it wasn't really announced until later. Very early on, as we heard from former National Security Advisor Tom Donilon in a speech that he gave at CSIS, administration advisors, even before the president was inaugurated, I understand, talked about where we were overinvested in the region, where we were underinvested. And it was so clear that the economic dynamism in the Asia-Pacific was so important to the rejuvenation of the American economy, and the institutions that were being formed in the Asia-Pacific region, like the East Asia Summit, we needed to be a part of. And that decision was made really very, very early on. So I think that the rebalanced Asia from the beginning was about including China, and it is China's more coercive behavior that we saw really take full form, I think, in 2010 and then thereafter, that has caused it to have a sharper edge in dealing with China, in large part because of the magnetic demand pull from the region, which has been calling on the United States to be more involved diplomatically, economically, and militarily to give them some backing so that they too can stand up for their interests.
The gentleman's time has expired. Chairman Forbes is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of you for being here. You know, to each of you, three witnesses, I appreciate your work. I have enormous respect for what you've done, your expertise. Undoubtedly, that's shared by both of our subcommittees and the staffs, or else they wouldn't have invited you here. So in that collective expertise, Ms. Glass, I want to start with you, but I want both of our other witnesses to weigh in on this. You mentioned this concept of strategy. We've been groping around in the night to try to find it. And as I think all of us recognize, we agreed with the concept of a pivot or rebalance to the Asia-Pacific area, but we also believe very strongly we needed to have a strategy that we could get our hands around. In July of last year, I wrote a letter to Susan Rice requesting that the administration do an interagency review of their strategy so that we could articulate that and know what it was. I got a very prompt response back 3 months later that said that they had done that. They called it a vision, first of all, and then they came back and said, we are continuing to implement our comprehensive strategy. But I've yet to find anybody that can really articulate that strategy, or any of the agencies that say, yeah, we've sat down and done this. In the new omnibus bill that's coming out, there's good language in here, because we require, within 90 days after the enactment of that provision, that the Secretary of State do just that, develop that strategy and give an integrated multi-year planning and budget strategy for rebalancing of the United States policy in Asia back to the respective committees. In your expertise and knowledge, do you believe that strategy exists today? Do we have any such interagency strategy that we have developed, or do you think that's something that yet needs to be designed and developed?
That is indeed a very important question. I think that there are pieces of the strategy. I don't think they are necessarily well coordinated. I think that the Defense Department is working very effectively within the constraints of budget cuts and potential future sequestration cuts. And I think that they are very focused on the problem.
I don't want to interrupt you. I want just to add this too. We are being told by so many people that weigh in on this that this needs to be a more holistic approach, though. It can't be just DOD.
Yes.
Do you agree with that?
And that's exactly the point that I was going to make. We really do need more of a whole-of-government approach. You can't just have the diplomatic piece working by itself and independently, in the economic piece and the military piece. I think it is very helpful when there is a central document that is generated in the administration that assigns various responsibilities to certain agencies, and then they all see how the means and the ends come together in the pursuit of very specific objectives. I don't think that the administration has done that yet. There have been some very good speeches that have been given by senior administration officials, but they are not seen by the region as sufficient enough to ease their concerns about U.S. staying power. There is growing concern in the region that the United States is being distracted, that the priorities of some of the officials in government are elsewhere, and the United States is a global power. We have priorities in many places in the world, and just because we happen to be doing something in the Middle East today doesn't mean that we can't also address our interests and the interests of the wider countries in the region at the same time. And a document like this, I think, will go a long way towards easing that concern and actually generating a more coherent strategy within the administration. So I'm very much in support of this effort.
Mr. Dutton, Mr. Smith, how do you feel about it?
I do agree, actually, and one of the problems we're confronting is that there's really a certain, I'm going to call it strategic ambivalence here, in that, on the one hand, the administration seems to want to achieve a stable relationship with China. On the other hand, it wants to reassure friends, allies, and partners in the region, and that those have become an increasingly difficult goals to reconcile because of the friction between the two in the region. So we do, I think, need to, rather than simply say we want to deter, prevent, and maintain stability, we need to articulate a positive regional end state. In other words, what would a positive regional system in Asia look like, and how could we then begin to move closer toward it over time, rather than simply saying we don't want anything bad or destabilizing or negative to occur in the region. How do we make it a positive region?
I want to associate myself with Bonnie and Peter's remarks, and also say that I do think there's a great deal of room for us to further flesh out this pivot strategy. I get frequently asked, not only by Chinese guests, but also by visiting fellows from other Asian countries, what does the pivot mean? Is it sustainable? What exactly are you trying to accomplish with it? And we're not always able to provide them good answers. There's a great deal of uncertainty that remains in the region. One trend I do think that is positive is that we've been emphasizing more of an economic and diplomatic component to it rather than a purely military component. And I think that has helped the image of the pivot in the region. And I think we should continue to emphasize that. But I also don't think we should be ashamed of admitting our concerns. Well, I think we should be candid with China, and we should note that some aspects of the pivot are a reaction to increasingly provocative behavior. And while we're not putting ourselves in a position to contain China, we are putting ourselves in a position to respond if China's behavior grows more provocative.
Thank you. And, Mr. Chairman, I yield back, Bounceman.
Thank you. Let's see. I believe the gentlelady from Hawaii, Ms. Hanabusa, is recognized for 5 minutes at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In reading the testimony, I'm going to begin with Mr. Dutton. You had an interesting statement in your conclusion that basically you said, first and foremost, the United States must develop and deploy the naval, airspace, and cyber technologies required to ensure East Asia remains a maritime system. I'm curious about how you anticipate or envision that it remains a maritime system versus what other kind of system?
Yes, thank you very much for the question. So I started to introduce the idea in my opening comments that prior to 1840 and the introduction of British maritime power in the region, that Asia was a continental system, that, in other words, China on the continent could dominate the region because there were no threats that could impose strategic challenges for China from the sea. And this is really what China is trying to change in developing its force structure and in jurisdictionalizing the region. The problem with that is that there's the possibility of it becoming over time a closed system. In other words, limiting the economic and political freedom of action of other regional states unless China acknowledges or accepts what they're doing as being appropriate for China's interests. That limitation is also a problem for the United States because our political, our economic, and our security access requires an open system as well. Technology is the basis of an open maritime system. Ships, aircraft, supported by space and cyber power, are the way in which strategic power is generated in the region. And so I don't have specific force structure recommendations, but I do know that we need to develop and maintain the kind of force structure, the technology in the region that enables us to ensure that the maritime domain remains open, remains freedom of navigation remains, not just for commercial purposes, but for security purposes as well, in order to keep this system vibrant and open and connected to the global system.
So, am I hearing you correctly that when you talked about it maintaining or remaining a maritime system, that you're really saying that the United States must maintain its dominance in Asia Pacific as a maritime power? Is that what you're saying? And that somehow that maritime power base will then keep China in check and keep are commercial lines open, trade flowing? Is that what you're alluding to with this statement?
In short, the answer is yes. What I mean to say is exactly how much power and how much force structure is required. That's a very difficult assessment that I'm not qualified to make, frankly. And so, one thing that is important, though, is that there's a scale between dominance, sea supremacy, and sea denial on the other end, where you can't go. And somewhere in between there is where the United States needs to be sure that we can act. We don't need sea supremacy or total control. We need to recognize that China has legitimate security interests, right? But we do need to also, at the same time, recognize that we have legitimate security interests in the same space. And so we need to ensure our access to that space to preserve our security interests.
And one of the recommendations, of course, that you made that was pointed out earlier was our undersea dominance, which is really submarine capacity, correct? Yes. Now, but it's still what you are alluding to, though you said you don't know what the force structure will look like. What you're alluding to is that it's really not a balanced system that you want out there. You want something that will keep China in check. So therefore, it would only make logical sense that the United States and its allies must somehow dominate or have an advantage to keep China in check. That seems to be, though you don't know what it means yet, that seems to be where you're headed with that statement.
Well, I would say sufficient power to ensure our access. That's
in other words,
a little different.
So we don't have to worry about what we call the A2AD, the area access and access denial. Is that what you're saying?
It's our ability to overcome any kind of A2AD or counter intervention capability, as China often I think refers to it. It's our ability to ensure that we cannot be excluded at China's will. It's not the same thing as ensuring that we keep China in check. It's a balance in between the two.
I understand what you're saying, but it still has to come down to some measure of something. In other words, as policymakers, as we sit here, we are going to have to put numbers to what you are saying, and there's got to be something that measures that for us. And what you're saying is you don't have the answer, it's just that it's got to be measured somehow.
That's fair enough. Yes, sir. I think, ma'am, I would defer to the Navy staff for that.
The gentlelady's time has expired. The gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrabacher, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. From what I am understanding from the testimony so far is that there is no strategy in place right now in terms of American strategy in the far Pacific Asian region. Anybody disagree with that? Okay. Let me suggest then that what I have heard suggests to me that the pivot was a slogan signifying that we are changing emphasis, but it's not based on some thought-out strategy. Would that be inaccurate, correct, or correct? But please feel free to comment, disagree, whatever.
Okay, I'm happy to, Mr. Congressman. I think that your critique, perhaps from my perspective, is a bit harsh. There was no initial strategy document that was guiding the pivot. I think that it evolved piecemeal over a period of time. I think we have seen some important diplomatic, economic, and military aspects of it, but they haven't yet come together from my perspective.
Right. So there's
a
not
coherent
a strategy. It's not a strategy.
Yes,
it's something that's piecemeal, is going by time. Let me let you know, I flew over the Spratly Islands about 10 years ago after being kept from doing this. As a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, our government, meaning our State Department, felt compelled to prevent me from seeing what was going on in the Spratly Islands, and I eventually had to commandeer a plane from the Philippine Air Force to fly me over the Spratly Islands, all right? At that time, the Spratlys were, there were some Chinese naval vessels there, clearly warships. Have the Spratly Islands been fortified since those days when I flew over there? So for the last 10 years, as piecemeal policy is being developed here in Washington, or a response that they have been fortifying the Spratly Islands? Am I inaccurate in that suggestion? Yeah, they're fortifying the Spratly Island. So the piecemeal message we've been giving them as to our strategy is that we are cowards and we are weak. Just don't confront us and you can get away with what you want. And now we see China challenging us in a way that threatens our security and threatens the peace of the world by putting Japan and our other allies on the spot. Surprise, surprise. Well, I would hope that the pivot becomes more than just a slogan and that we really take advantage of maybe whatever time we've got left to work with our allies. Luckily, we have a new sign of strength in Japan, and we should all be grateful and praise President Abe and give him all the backing we can, coupled with one thing. We are weaker than we were 10 years ago. We are weaker than when we walked into Iraq and wasted $1 trillion and thousands of our lives and demoralized the American people, so we're not able to make those kind of foreign commitments again. So you know what we have to do? We have to make sure Australia, we have to make sure Japan, Korea, and our other allies in that area know that we will support them in their efforts to confront this aggression. And that should be the strategy and the formula. Maybe you'd like to comment on that strategy. Anybody? I guess what I'm saying is maybe we should have Abe agree with Abe that he should expand his military forces, and thus we don't necessarily have to send another 2 aircraft carrier battle groups there at a cost of, what, $50 billion to the American people to offset this expansion of China into that region. Does that make sense?
We are undertaking a project at CSIS. We're looking at, it's our President John Hamre's idea, to look into how we could pursue more what he calls federated defense, which is encouraging greater collaboration among our allies, not only in the area of deployments, but also in exercises and procurement, so we can try and limit duplication,
I've got
get
20
force
seconds left.
multipliers.
It's a great idea, what you said. How about the idea of creating an OSCE that is now focused on Europe, of course, but an OSCE that would be Asia-focused and having just an organization of democratic states like that for Asia? Would that help give China a message that we are united behind democratic countries?
In principle, it's a good idea, but in a short answer, what I would say is there is no country in the region that wants to be compelled to choose between the United States and China. And being part of that kind of organization would appeal to some countries, but for some that are geographically very close to China, very dependent on China economically, would not want to be put in that position.
Well, let's just make sure that Mr. Abe and our Korean friends and our friends down in Australia and our other close friends who do want to be with us know that we are encouraging them to stand up to this challenge, because they will be the ones who have to stand up. Our government seems to be pivoting around the world and trying to take in the information and develop some strategy for the future. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from the Commonwealth of Virginia, Mr. Connolly, is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the Chair. And, Mr. Chairman, I have an opening statement I'd ask be entered into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
I thank the Chair, and I thank the panel for being here. And I'm always, and I always enjoy the thoughts of my friend from California. And I have so many reactions to so much of what he had to say. I would note, as a student of history, there are others in Asia who have made the miscalculation of mistaking American resolve, and with tragic consequences for them and for us. But I would hope that others in the region today would not make a similar miscalculation, because some think we are weak. Weakness is in the eye of the beholder. I certainly share my colleagues' views about the folly of Iraq and the terrible price the United States has paid and the diversion it represents. I'm not sure. Maybe my friend would be happier if we had a white paper on the pivot and then we could call it a strategy. I happen to think the pivot is an enlightened decision by the United States, and is going to involve lots of elements. We are seeing one of them as we speak, the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is going to be a very important economic anchor and political anchor. and it's very much in the face of China. My friend lionizes the Prime Minister, not President of Japan, Mr. Abe. It might be useful if Mr. Abe wishes to really exercise moral as well as political leadership in the region, if he were to acknowledge the sins of Japan, especially with respect to Korea, from the recent unpleasantness known as World War II. That might be a useful start if Mr. Abe wishes to exercise regional leadership. Let me ask you about the situation. I mean, China seems to have gone out of its way to provoke the Philippines, South Korea, Taiwan, Vietnam, Japan, and the United States, the Spratly Islands, as Mr. Rohrabacher talks about, the Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands. What is in the thinking of Japan? I mean, of China. Is it deliberately being provocative, or is it unmindful or uncaring of the consequences of such provocation? Your sense, Mr. Dutton, and we can go down the panel.
Thank you very much. Yes, I believe it is deliberate provocation for the purpose of achieving at least two sets of objectives. One set of objective is domestic. It's internal. This type of friction, I think, it's managed friction. It's creating it, but managing it, avoiding escalation, in order to ensure domestic stability in the sense that the Chinese Communist Party remains the center of governance within the Chinese.
So you think it's more internal than anything else?
It's tough to assess,
okay.
but it's a very important
I'm
part.
going to come back and ask you about miscalculation, but I want to give Ms. Glazer and Mr. Smith a quick chance to comment.
Very quickly, I think there is an inextricable linkage between the domestic situation and the external situation for China. I think that the Communist Party is seeking to rejuvenate itself. Its legitimacy is very much wrapped up with not making any concessions on territorial and sovereignty in these maritime disputes. So I think that the Chinese are going to continue to adhere to this. They don't want to make concessions on these. They also want good relations with their neighbors. Up till now, they haven't been compelled to make a choice.
Mr. Smith.
I'd like to add India to that long list of countries that China has been provoking in recent years. In fact, India may have been one of the first. I think this behavior really began in 2009, and actually in doing some research for a book on China-India relations, one of the things that frequently came up was, in assessing China's behavior in recent years, don't underestimate the effect that the global financial crisis had on the thinking of their leadership. That really America's decline, this was the beginning of America's decline, and the time had come for China's rise, that they had weathered the storm much better than we had, or in fact anyone else around the world, and if the time to reassert China's authority in Asia, it was now.
Okay, final point, though. What one worries about as a student of history is miscalculation. Okay, so that's your thinking, and that's what you're doing, and it has a lot of internal domestic pressure, which not unique to China, not unique at this moment in history. But what can happen is a miscalculation, because the fact externally is this is a provocative set of behavior that could provoke something not planned, not intended, nonetheless real. Mr. Dutton, Ms. Glazer, Ms. Smith, you want to quickly comment?
Yes, it's absolutely the
case. The chair will
case.
allow them to finish answering. My questions are over.
Without objection.
I thank the chair.
It's absolutely the case that it's a dangerous game, and what we can see clearly is that it has provoked American attention and American concern, and the same thing throughout the region. And I think it's achieved what China sought to prevent, which is balancing behavior against China directly. It's unfortunate, but I think that's what it's achieved.
I would just say that the Chinese are insufficiently worried about miscalculation and accident, and quite confident, frankly, that they could control escalation. If they were worried about this, they would not have announced that new ADIZ, which the potential for their aircraft flying over these disputed islands in the East China Sea, then being intercepted by Japanese fighters and responded to by Chinese fighters scrambling. This carries, I think, great inherent danger. And I don't think the Chinese appreciate this significantly.
I would agree, and I understand why China's policy in the region seems so counterintuitive, because I think it has done their image great harm. And on the flip side of that, we must never forget sort of the silver lining, which is that countries in the region who maybe 10 years ago were tiring of American power and authority or looking for alternatives are now welcoming the U.S. back with great enthusiasm. So as we confront this challenge, we must also look at it as an opportunity.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. First, I'm just trying to understand the law of the sea and the convention of the law of the sea. It's my understanding that if there's a tiny speck just barely above water, the smallest possible island, that whoever owns that island controls 125,000 nautical miles, 200 miles in every direction, of that speck with regard to economic exploitation. Is that true?
I'm sorry, sir, no, it's not true. A small island that is uninhabitable or that can produce no economic activity of its own gets no more than 12 nautical miles around it, and that's only if it's above water at high tide.
And does an artificial island get anything?
It does not.
And if there's like one family that lives on the island, does it then get the 200 miles?
Well, we're hoping that the Philippine arbitration can help us understand what the law says about these questions. It is one of the most important aspects of China's or of the Philippines' desire to get a international law perspective on these questions.
Okay, and if if it is inhabited, I assume that an island that was previously uninhabited that gains habitation counts as a habitable island. Is that accurate?
Well, it's a little difficult to know, and here's why. Because what does habitation mean has so far not been answered. And if you just put soldiers down on an island, but you have to truck in water or fly in water, is that habitation? No, probably not. So the answer is not yet definitive in international law, but it's pretty clear that it has to be self-sustaining habitation, and that was a permanent.
Well, of course, a vacation island. There are many vacation islands with thriving economies that exist only because tourists spend money to be there.
Well, if they're self-sustaining and from what the resources of the island can produce, then they probably would get.
You put a rich family on an island, you have a tourist resort. But there's even the smallest inhabited island does get the 125,000 square miles, nautical miles of. It can be a small island with as long as it's inhabited. Is that correct?
As long as it's inhabited, it gets a 200-mile exclusive economic zone. Yes, I haven't done the math.
Wow. Now, Japan would certainly like. So the islands that are in dispute for the most part are viewed as uninhabited and in control only 12 miles?
Yeah. In the Spratlys, there are about 45 islands that are the major groups that are the larger of the islands, 45 of which are inhabited, technically inhabited. Whether they're legally inhabited is a different question. We don't know.
Gotcha. But
technically inhabited by.
So we have to both determine the ownership of the islands and whether they are inhabited.
That's right.
And these islands have been of scant economic value up until now. We're told that we should be spending trillions of dollars reorienting our entire military establishment to defend the economic rights of countries that spend, in case of Japan, only 1% of its GDP. This is a kind of a rhetorical question, but if there is oil on any of these islands, the American taxpayer doesn't get any of it, right?
So the answer to that question is there are three problems. We're only being asked to deal with one of them, not the sovereignty question, not even the jurisdictional question over how do you draw resource boundaries, but control. Whether the coastal state China has the right to limit freedom of navigation for military purposes or not. That's the key American interest.
Well, the reason they're trying to do it, presumably, is the resources. And of course, Japan also has the same kind of notification zone that China has been criticized for creating. My time's almost expired. I'll ask any witness with Ms. Glazer. Do you have?
Well, with all due respect, sir, I do think that your perspective is a narrow interpretation of American interests. No, we may not get directly all the fish or
we
or the
have
oil.
a tremendous interest in everything in the world, and we could have a $5 trillion military, and it wouldn't be sufficient to deal with every occasion where people have sat in front of me and said, we have vital interests, and the interests of our allies are at stake, and we must take action.
I believe that our interests.
If we could just phone this one in, fine. But our entire military is looking at this as a chance to face a noble foe, a chance to be in the kind of conflict that is far less frustrating than fighting insurgencies and fighting asymmetrical warfare. All for some islands where our interests may be just as vital as they are in every other square inch of this planet. There is no shortage of interests.
The gentleman's time has expired. Unless one of the witnesses want to respond briefly, Ms. Glazer, and briefly, Ms.
I would just like to briefly comment. There may be some individuals in the military that hold those views. Those that I speak with and people who are in higher levels in this administration and even prior administrations, I think would argue differently, that our goal is not to encourage China to be an enemy or to organize our military against China, that we very much want to see China emerge peacefully and become part of this rules-based system. I don't think about our presence in the Asia-Pacific is simply about protecting tiny specks of rocks or other things in the waters. I think it goes way beyond that, and it is freedom of navigation. It is maintaining access and freedom to maneuver within the area, without which we will have no credibility as a presence and a provider of balancing force in the region to help protect not only our own interests, but those of our allies and partners.
Mr. Dutton?
Yes, quite briefly, I'd like to say the pivotal rebalance is not about looking for a glorious enemy or some noble foe. It's about a return to America's fundamental security and strategic interests.
I would simply say that a nation with our economic problems has fundamental interests at home, and that the fundamental interests that you're talking about are no more significant than those in the Eastern Mediterranean, those in the Caribbean, hundreds of other conflicts, most of them not in the headlines today. And could we limit our military to merely a $5 trillion budget if we dealt with every set of witnesses that told us of a critical national security, vital interests, position critical to our standing in the world? I would say that Japan, the real beneficiary of some of the actions you suggest, limits its military to 1% of GDP.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair would ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 days to supplement any statements or submit any questions. And I would like to recognize the chair, Chairman Forbes, for the purpose of making a statement and recognize the panel.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, first of all, thank you for allowing us to do this. And to each of you, we recognize the time that you spent in to prepare to be here today. This is a very important hearing, but equally it's a very important record for us to create. So our subcommittee always likes to give our witnesses an opportunity, if you need to either complete or to make sure your responses were complete and accurate. If there's anything that you feel briefly you need to put on the record to supplement or clarify anything that you've said, we'd like to give you that opportunity now. And if you don't do it now, please feel free to submit it to us later. We'll start in the order that you spoke, Mr. Dutton. Anything else that you have for us for the record that you'd like to offer?
Yes, sir. I have 4 points. I'll be as quick as I can. The first is, I think it's important to note that China has not been as dangerously, quote, aggressive as A, they could be, or B, they have been at different times in the past. China has been through, the People's Republic of China has been through 4 phases in their approaches to the island disputes and the water disputes in East Asia. The first phase from 1949 to 1974 was they ignored them, essentially. From 74 to 88 or so, they did, in fact, use military power to change the circumstances on the ground a number of times during that time frame. From roughly 1990 to the mid-2000s, China went on a charm offensive, trying to buy the goodwill of the regional states regarding these disputes. And then finally, most recently, this non-militarized coercion that we're seeing now. And the problem that we're having with is that we have too few tools to grapple with this particular strategy. We could manage the previous ones. We have too few tools to manage this one. The second point that I'd like to make is in talking about whether China will be weaker or stronger in the future, it's almost the wrong question. We have 1.3 billion globally connected, economically connected people now that a generation ago were not. That economic connectivity has a gravitational pull of its own, which means that China's economy will be a powerful force of some kind in the future. Whatever the GDP futures look like, I don't know. My crystal ball is cloudy, but I will say that China will have substantial economic and political power, substantial enough to choose to make military power in the future if that's where they choose to balance how to spend their money. Whether it's on social spending or military spending, we don't know, but they will have plenty of spending when you have 1.3 billion globally connected, economically connected people. The third point I want to make is to reiterate that freedom of navigation and the essence of American security around the world is based on American ability to navigate around the world in and through the commons, and that requires us to support the laws and norms of freedom of navigation and to exercise leadership over those norms. I believe we need to accede to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. The world is crying out for American leadership of some kind. And in order for us to exercise that leadership, getting inside the system and running the system from inside rather than standing outside it is how we're going to best get the support and the coalescence of power that we need in order to confront what China is pushing at us with on this point. And then the last point I wanted to make, and it's also related to freedom of navigation. It's also related to the fundamental strategic roots of American security, and that is our ability to ensure our security presence in Europe and the Middle East and in Asia. Those three regions are, and our ability to access them for security purposes is the foundation of American security. It's possible for America to re-articulate a fundamentally different security strategy, and that may be something we would want to do in the future. But it's a world in which our options and our opportunities become significantly constrained.
Thank you, Ms. Glaser. Very briefly, any other comments that you?
Yes, thank you very much. I'll just make 2 points. One is that there are these ongoing worries and concerns about U.S. staying power in the region. This is not going to be attainable, this reassurance, probably over any period of time. It's just an effort that the United States has to keep up at every day, every week, every month, every year. We have to give these countries in the region confidence that the United States is going to continue to be there, that it's not enough just to say we're a resident power, but we really have to be involved in the life of the region. And countries are so welcoming of the United States. So it's a great opportunity, but we really have to continue to do this. If we are not sufficiently providing this reassurance, I really do think that there is a risk that some of the smaller countries in the region are going to feel that they have to accommodate to terms that are being dictated to them, in part and mostly by China, but that they prefer not to accede to. The second point that I'd like to make is that one of the fundamental sources of instability in the region, and particularly in the South China Sea, is the 9-dash line and the ambiguity of the 9-dash line. So it originated in 1947. It was an 11-dash line. You know, we all know this. But today, what does it mean The Chinese themselves have these internal debates about what it means. And we all need to compel China to tell us and the world, and particularly its neighbors, what does it mean? Is it China's EEZ? Is it a national boundary? Does China simply claim the land features and then the waters that those legally generate under UNCLOS? Clarification of this by China, I think, would go a long way towards beginning to create the kind of circumstances in which countries can begin to collaborate, maybe joint economic exploitation, fisheries agreements, and things of that nature that might diffuse some of the tensions. Thank you.
Thank you. And Ms. Smith, last brief word on your comment.
Yep, just a brief remark for Congressman Sherman, who I think in an era of budget constraints, this type of skepticism is actually very healthy. This is an issue where we all seem to be on the same page. So having some critical thinking and really prodding us to think through this is most welcome. And I'm sure everyone who comes before you says that their issue in their region of the world is of utmost importance and is, a vital national security interest. I think in this case you really can make a valid and rational case that China is unique, that it's the one country that is capable of posing a genuine conventional threat to the U.S. military in the 21st century. And in addition to that is the one country that is really is engaging in a lot of provocative behavior with its neighbors. And it's not just a territorial dispute issue with its neighbors, it's also attempting to restrict our freedom to operate in the Western Pacific. It is something that impinges directly on our national security interests and is not merely an issue for our allies. But thank you for voicing this concern.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. I'd like to thank the chair and the ranking members that were here earlier for their cooperation and making this very important hearing possible, and I want to especially thank our distinguished panel this afternoon for their very helpful testimony. If there's no further business to come before the committee, we're adjourned. Thank you.